I was 18 the autumn my uncle handed me a deed to 40 acres nobody wanted, and the first thing I learned was that a gift can be a way of sending someone off to die without having to say the words. The paper was folded twice and soft at the creases, the way money gets soft when too many hands have worried it, and my Uncle Royce did not look at me when he passed it across the table. He looked at the window. Outside, the Laramie Plains ran flat and gray to the edge of the world, and somewhere past the edge sat the parcel he had just made mine, a long shoulder of land in the foothills that everyone in the valley called the Boneyard because nothing grew there but stone. It was October of 1887. My father had been dead 4 months. The deed was the whole of my inheritance, and Royce meant it as the end of his obligation to me, a clean settling of accounts, a door closed soft so the closing would not carry. I did not understand yet that he had handed me the only thing worth having. Stay with me, because the people who laughed loudest that autumn were the ones who came up the road first when the cold came, and I want you to see their faces when they did. I am getting ahead of the story, though, and the story begins with stone. My name is Esther Crane, and before the plains, I had been a carpenter's daughter in a town that no longer needs naming, raised at the elbow of a man who built things to outlast the people who paid for them. My father, Amos, was a quiet man with a rule he repeated so often it wore a groove in me. He said a wall does not hold because it is strong. He said a wall holds because it knows where the weight wants to go and lets it go there. I was 6 the first time he said it and 12 the first time I understood it. And by the time he died, I had laid more cold stone with my own hands than most grown men in that county had laid in their lives. He took me onto his work the way other fathers took sons because there were no sons, only me, and he never once told me a girl could not set a stone. He told me instead that a stone does not know whose hand sets it, only whether the hand has read it true. We would sit of an evening with a guttering lamp between us, and he would draw on the back of an old bill the way the courses of a wall should step, and lean, and he would make me say back to him why each one went where it did, and he would not let me up from the table until I could. I thought, when I was small, that this was simply how all fathers passed their evenings. I know now it was a man pouring everything he had into the only vessel he was given, working against a clock he could hear, and I could not. He left me no money. There was no money to leave. What he left me lived in my hands, and in the spring of my 18th year, when the fever took him in 9 days, and the doctor charged for every one of them, my hands were all I carried out of that house. I remember the last lesson he gave me, 3 days before the end, when the fever had him and he did not always know the year, but he knew stone the way a man knows his own name long after he has forgotten everything else. He took my wrist in his hot, dry hand and he said, "When you build for the cold, build the warmth the long road home, and never let the wall stand straight and proud, for pride is what frost prizes most." I did not understand it then. I wrote it down because he asked me to, on the back of the same old bill we had drawn on 100 times, and I folded it into the tin box where I kept the few things that were mine, and I did not look at it again for 3 years. Royce was my mother's brother, and he took me in because there was no one else, and he was glad past hiding when the 40 acres gave him a reason to take me back out again. The boneyard sat 4 miles from the nearest neighbor and rose toward a ridge of broken granite that the wind had been working at since before there were men to watch it. The valley people had a settled opinion of that ground. They had tried to run cattle on it, and the cattle had broken their legs in the rockfall. They had tried to plow the lower bench and turned up nothing but more stone, fist-sized, wagon-sized, a buried orchard of it. So they let it sit, and they let the name sit on it. And when Royce gave it to a girl of 18, with no husband and no hand to help her, the valley found the whole arrangement funny in a way that made them generous with their advice and stingy with everything else. The man who set the tone was Calvin Doss, who kept the store at the crossroads and considered himself the valley's memory and its judge. The day I came in for nails and lamp oil, he leaned on his counter and looked at me the way a man looks at weather he expects to pass. He said, "So you're the one taking the boneyard," he said. "Well, there is good winter killing up there and not much else." The men along the wall laughed, easy and low, and Calvin smiled at having made them. I paid for my nails and I did not laugh, and I carried out the first of the load I would haul up that road for 2 months. What none of them knew, because none of them had bothered to climb the ridge and look, was that the stone they cursed was the finest building granite I had ever set my eyes on. My father had taught me to read rock the way other people read faces, and the boneyard was an open book to me, page after page of clean gray granite split into near square blocks by 100,000 years of frost doing the same work, over and over, that I meant to put it to. Where the valley saw an affliction, I saw a quarry that had already cut itself. Where they saw ground that killed cattle, I saw the bones of a house that would not burn, would not rot, would not blow down, and would hold the warmth of a single fire, the way a banked coal holds it through the night. I climbed that ridge the first clear day I owned it, and I walked it end to end with Asa at my heel, and I knelt and laid my bare hand flat on the cold face of an outcrop the way my father used to, and I felt the grain of it, and I knew before I rose what I would build and how long it would take me, and that I would do it alone. I did not say any of this in the store. My father had also taught me that a thing argued is a thing weakened, and that the only argument stone respects is the wall you raise with it. So I let them talk. I went up the ridge with a wagon, a borrowed mule named Pim, who was older than I was and twice as stubborn, and a deerhound my father had raised from a pup, a long gray dog called Asa, who had slept at the foot of my bed every night of my life, and now slept at the mouth of a canvas lean-to while I learned the shape of my own land. The first weeks Asa kept me company against a loneliness I will not pretend I did not feel. 18, and motherless and fatherless on a hill the whole valley had named for the dead. And at night, when the coyotes worked the draws below, he would put his long head across my feet, and the weight of him was the only warmth in the lean. To that the cold did not take. I want to tell you how a wall gets built, because the building of it is the heart of this, and because everything that happened later was already decided in the way I set those first courses. I did not dig a foundation the way the valley would have. I went down to bedrock, which on the lower bench was never more than 2 feet under the rubble, and I keyed the first course of stone directly into the living rock of the ridge, so the house and the mountain would be one thing and not two. I cut steps into the bedrock with a chisel and a steady week of mornings, so that each foundation stone sat down into the mountain like a tooth into a jaw, and once a stone was keyed that way, no frost on earth could heave it, because to lift it, the frost would have had to lift the ridge. My father called this marrying the wall to the ground. He said a house that only sits on the earth is a guest, and a guest can be asked to leave, but a house keyed to the bone of the world is kin, and kin stays. I chose the lee of the ridge, the north side where the granite rose in a natural shoulder that would break the worst of the wind before it ever reached me, and I set the long axis of the house along the curve of that shoulder, so the prevailing weather would slide past rather than strike flat. These were not guesses. These were lessons, each one paid for in some winter my father had survived before I was born, handed down to me across a kitchen table the way other fathers hand down a watch or a name. I built the walls 3 feet thick at the base and battered them, which means I sloped them inward as they rose, so that every stone leaned its weight back into the hill instead of standing straight up and trusting to mortar. That frost would crack by February. I did not trust mortar. I used it, but I did not trust it, and I laid every stone, so that if every ounce of mortar in the wall turned to dust, the wall would still stand by the friction of dressed granite, and the honest pull of its own weight toward the ground. I dressed each block by hand, sitting cross-legged in the rubble with a hammer and a row of chisels my father had ground himself, and I learned the boneyard granite the way you learn a person, where it would split willing and where it would fight you, which faces wanted to be the outside of a wall and which the in. And a good day was 11 stones set true. A bad day was 3 and a torn hand. The work was slow past the patience of anyone watching, and the valley watched, and what they saw was a girl moving rock from one part of a cursed hill to another part of the same cursed hill, which to them was the very picture of a wasted life. Between the inner and outer faces of the wall I left a cavity, and into that cavity I packed dry earth and small stone and the broken chips from my own dressing, tamped down in lifts the way my father had taught me to tamp a road. And that dead air and packed rubble in the heart of the wall was the thing that would later hold the warmth and turn the cold. Though no one looking at the house from the road could have told it was there, I kept the fillbone dry. I hauled it up under canvas and packed it on clear days only, because my father's last lesson and his oldest one agreed on this, that water in a wall is a traitor that waits for the cold to do its work, and a wet wall is a broken wall that does not yet know it. I roofed it with peeled lodgepole laid close and chinked, then a foot of sod over birch bark, so the roof was a meadow you could stand on, and the snow that fell on it became a blanket and not a burden. The single door I hung myself, of 3-inch plank, cross-braced and pinned, set into a frame I had wedged so tight that the whole weight of the wall pressed down on it and made it part of the stone. I set the hearth deep into the thickness of the back wall and built it narrow at the throat, so it threw its heat into the room and not up the flue, and I ran the spring along a channel behind the firewall so that the same stone that held the fire kept the water from freezing. There was one window, set high and small and double shuttered, because a window is a hole in an argument, and I wanted only the one. By the end of October the shell stood, and by then the valley had stopped finding me funny and started finding me strange. Calvin Doss rode out in November under the excuse of seeing whether I needed anything, which in that country is the polite name for coming to look. He sat his horse at the foot of my road and considered the house a long while, and I watched him do it from where I knelt dressing a stone for the threshold. He did not get down. He said it was a tomb. He said it again, louder, in case the wind had taken it, that I had gone and built myself a tomb on the boneyard and would be the first to lie in it. And he laughed the way he had laughed in the store, only there was no wall of men to laugh with him now, and the sound went thin in the open air. Then he said the thing the valley would say all winter, that the Crane girl had buried herself alive up on the ridge, and he turned his horse and rode back down to carry the line to the store. I let it go. Asa lifted his head and watched the horse out of sight and then put it down again, and I went back to my threshold stone, and I will tell you plainly that the word tomb did not trouble me half so much as a hairline of frost I had found that morning in the mortar of the north wall, which troubled me a great deal and which I spent the rest of that day correcting. I should tell you about the woman who did not laugh, because the valley was not all of one mind, and the one voice raised against the rest belongs in this as much as Calvin's does. Her name was Hannah Voss, a widow of 60 who kept the next homestead down the creek and had buried 2 husbands and outlasted both their reputations. She came up the road in November with a crock of beans and no advice at all, which made her the only visitor I trusted. She walked the length of my wall with one hand trailing on the stone, the way you touch the flank of a horse you are judging, and at the end of it she said only that her own father had built like this in the old country, and that he had died warm at 90 in a house his grandson still lived in. She said the valley had forgotten more than it knew. She did not stay long. Before she left, she stood in my doorway and looked at the deep, narrow hearth and the thick walls and the one small window had set high and shuttered, and she said, "When it comes, you bring whoever can reach you." I did not know what she meant by "when it comes." I thought she meant the loneliness. I know now she meant the winter, and that she had read the sky that autumn the way I read stone, and that she was telling me, in the only way her pride allowed, to keep the door ready. If you have ever been the one person in a room who could see a thing coming that no one would let you name, then you already know how Hannah looked at me in that doorway. And you may want to stay to the end of this, because she was right. I have wandered from the cold long enough. Let me bring it on. There was one more day of laughter before the laughter ended for good. The week before Christmas, the valley held its winter gathering at the church, and I went down for the first time since October, because Hannah told me a person who never shows her face becomes a story instead of a neighbor. And a story is easier to leave out in the cold. Calvin Doss was there, warm with cider and the attention of the room, and when I came in, he raised his cup and called across the floor that here was the valley's own gravedigger, come down from her tomb to remind us all where we'd be lying come spring. The room laughed. It was the third time I had heard him fix that word to my house, in the store and at my road, and now in the house of worship with the whole valley too. Witness it, and I marked it, the way you mark a stone that has split wrong, so you will know it again. I did not answer him. I drank a cup of cider, and I spoke kindly to the few who spoke kindly to me. And I went back up the ridge before dark, and behind me the word tomb went around the warm room like a cold passed hand to hand, and not one of them felt how cold the air outside the church had already begun to turn. The cold came on the 11th of January, and it did not come the way cold usually came to that valley. It came the way a flood comes, all at once, and from a direction no one was watching. The morning of the 11th was warm enough that the snow on my roof had begun to soften, and by noon the sky to the northwest had gone the color of a bruise, a low brown purple shelf of cloud that came on without hurry and swallowed the sun whole. I was splitting kindling in the yard when it came over, and I felt the air change against my face the way you feel a hand laid on the back of your neck, and I knew before the first flake fell that this was the thing Hannah had read in the autumn sky. The temperature did not fall. It dropped. By dark it stood at 20 below, and by the second morning at 40 below, and the wind that drove down off the ridge was a living weight that leaned on the door and searched every seam of the house for a way in. The third night it found nothing, and the fourth night it found nothing, and somewhere in nights of nothing the wind seemed to give up on my door the way a thief gives up on a lock and moves down the street to easier houses. I had fuel for 90 days. I had water from a spring I had walled into the back of the house itself so it could not freeze. I had Asa at the hearth and Pim in a stone byre I had built against the north wall to share the warmth, and I had a house that was, that first night, exactly as warm as I had built it to be, which is to say warm enough that I sat in my shift by the fire and mended a glove while the world outside turned to iron. I marked the days on the doorframe with a nail, one scratch a morning, the way my father had taught me to keep count. When counting is the only work the cold leaves you, I did not yet know what the rest of Valley was paying for the same hours. They were paying everything. The Valley homes were timber, most of them single-walled and chinked with clay that the cold had cracked years ago, and no one had thought worth mending because the cold had never been like this. The wind found those cracks. A house built to sit on the earth is a guest, my father had said, and that January the weather came as a landlord with the rent past due and put the whole valley out into the cold. The Pruitt family burned their fence rails the second night, and their furniture the third, and by the fourth they were burning the floorboards of their own loft, and watching the fire eat the house from the inside to keep the cold from eating them from the out. Old Dyer, who had laughed loudest at the store next to Calvin, watched his stovepipe glow and then go dark when the last of his coal was gone, and he and his wife survived only because they walked 4 miles through the storm to a neighbor whose fire still held, and they walked it in 40 below dark with the wind at their backs because to face it was to drown standing up. Two of the Selby children took sick with the cold in their chests. A hired man named Tomlin, caught between homesteads when the shelf of cloud came over, did not reach either, and they found him in the spring a half-mile from a door, sat down in the snow the way the cold makes a man want to sit and rest, when resting is the last thing he will ever do. I tell you these things not for the horror of them, but because you cannot measure what my Father gave me unless you set it beside what the valley had, and the valley had 90 years of habit and the comfort of numbers, and not one wall that knew where the weight wanted to go. On the fourth night of the cold they began coming up my road. I had not expected it, and I do not know to this day how the word spread in such weather, except that Hannah Voss had spread it before the weather came, telling whoever would listen that the Crane girls' tomb was the warmest building in the valley, and they had best swallow their laughing if it came to a choice between pride and freezing. The first to reach me were the Pruitts, the whole family of 6, the children blue at the lips and the father unable to make his hands work the latch so that I opened to a man weeping with cold who could not say why he had come. I brought them in. The house that I had built for one held them easily because I had built the room long and the hearth deep, and the thick walls that the valley had called a tomb gave back the warmth of 4 days of fire all at once, the way packed earth gives back the heat of a summer it has stored. By the 6th night I had 19 people under my roof and in my byre, and Pim stood patient among strangers, and Asa moved from bundle to bundle in the dark, like a shepherd counting a flock, and the spring in the back wall ran clear and unfrozen, and the single fire in the deep hearth held the whole room at a warmth a man could sleep in. 19 people. Not one of them took lasting harm. Outside, the valley was losing count of its dead. Calvin Doss came last, and he came on the 7th night, and the way he came is the thing I have carried longest. He did not come for himself. His own store had a stove and coal, and he might have ridden out the cold behind his counter. He came because the Selby children were failing, and their mother had run the 4 miles to his door, begging for the doctor who was himself snowbound, 12 miles off, and Calvin, who had no medicine and no skill, could think of nowhere on this earth to send them but the boneyard. He carried the smaller child himself, wrapped in his own coat, and he stood in my doorway with the storm at his back and the warm light on his face, and he could not make himself step over the sill, because to step over it was to walk into the proof of everything he had said and been wrong about, in front of the whole shivering valley packed into the room beyond. I took the child from him. I did not say anything. Hannah Voss took the second child and set them both by the fire and began the slow work of bringing warmth back to a small body, which must be done slowly or not at all. And Calvin stood in the doorway, with the cold pouring past him, and watched a girl he had called a fool keep his neighbors alive. Asa crossed the room and stood at his knee. There was a long quiet, the kind of quiet that has weight, and then Calvin Doss looked at the walls and looked at me and said the only thing he ever said to me about any of it. He said, "Your father taught you this." It was not a question. I told him yes. He stepped over the sill then, and he shut the door behind him against the cold, and he sat down among the people he had laughed with, and did not say another word that night. I gave him a place near the fire because he was cold, and because a man brought that low does not need a girl to bring him lower, and he sat with his hat in his hands and watched the firelight move on 3 feet of stone he had called a grave, and I saw him understand, slow and complete, that the warmth holding the room was the same warmth his neighbors had walked 4 miles in the dark to find, and some had not found at all. No one spoke for a long while. The fire ticked. A child turned in its sleep. Him shifted in the byre beyond the wall, and the small sound of him came through the stone. And outside the wind went on with its work and could not get in, and the room full of people who had laughed at me breathed slow and warm in the dark, and that breathing was the only answer I ever wanted, and the only one I ever got. I did not feel triumph. I want to be honest with you about that, because you may have come to this story. For the moment the proud man is brought down, and I will not pretend I never imagined it in the lonely autumn weeks. What I felt, sitting up that night to feed the fire while 19 people slept, was something quieter and harder to carry, which was the knowledge that my father was 4 months dead and would never see that his last lesson had kept a valley alive, and that the only place that knowledge would ever live now was in my own 2 hands, and in whatever hands I could pass it to before I went the way he had gone. The child by the fire lived. Both Selby children lived, though the younger one carried a weakness in the chest for years after, and the doctor, when he finally reached that valley, said plainly that the 4 who came through my door near death would have been 4 more in the ground had they stayed in their own houses one more night. The cold broke on the 19th day. The valley counted itself when it was over and found 11 gone. 11 out of a settlement of barely 200 souls, and the count would have been higher by a dozen if a carpenter's daughter had listened to the men in the store and built the kind of house they would have built for her. When the families went back down the road to thaw their own homes and bury their own dead, they did not go back saying tomb. They went back having slept warm in the heart of the ridge while the wind tore at 3 feet of stone and could not get in. And a thing you have slept safe inside of you, do not call a tomb again. What I did next is the part the valley remembered longest, longer than the cold itself. And it is the reason I am telling you this from the warm end of a long life instead of the cold end of a short one. I taught them. Calvin Doss came back in the spring, not to look this time, but to ask. And he asked the way a proud man asks, which is slowly and with his hat in his hand. He wanted to know how the wall held the warmth, so I showed him. I took him into the wall I was raising for Hannah Voss, who at 60 was tired of being cold, and I showed him the cavity in the heart of it, and the packed rubble and the dead air. And I told him what my father had told me, that the cold is not a thing that comes in, but a thing the warmth runs out to meet, and that a wall's whole work is to make the warmth's road long and slow and full of turns. That night, for the first time in 3 years, I took the old folded bill out of the tin box and read my father's last lesson again in my own girl's hand. Build the warmth a long road home, and never let the wall stand straight and proud. And I understood at last that he had handed me the whole winter in a single sentence and trusted me to grow into it. He did not understand it the first time, and neither in truth had I. Few did. That was the lesson the valley learned hardest, because a dozen men went home that spring and built thick walls and packed them with wet earth that froze and split the stone or battered them the wrong way. So the weight stood straight up and waited for frost. And their walls failed, and they cursed the method. The form was easy to copy. The understanding was not. The ones who came back a second time and a third, who asked why and not only how, those men built houses their grandchildren grew up warm in. The ones who copied the look and skipped the reason built handsome failures, and some of them blamed me for it, and I let them, because a man who will not learn the reason will not learn that either. My father had told me this too, that you cannot inherit a skill the way you inherit a watch, that it has to be set into the hands one lesson at a time. And I watched the truth of it play out across a whole valley in the years after the great cold. I lived 61 years more on the boneyard, and the ground that had killed cattle and earned a name fit for the dead became, in my lifetime, the most sought building stone in 3 counties. Men came with wagons and paid me for the granite the valley had once paid me nothing to take away, and they hauled it down to raise courthouses and churches and the long, warm walls of houses that learned, slowly, to know where the weight wanted to go. The name Boneyard fell off the land, the way a wrong name always falls off a thing in the end, and the valley took to calling the ridge Crane's Shoulder after the long curve of granite I had built my house against, though within a generation most who used the name had forgotten there had been a girl at all and thought the shoulder had always carried it. That did not trouble me. A name outliving its reason is only the world doing what walls do, holding the shape of a thing after the maker is gone. Asa lived 11 more years and died in his sleep by the same hearth he had guarded through the great cold, and I buried him at the foot of the north wall, where the stone he had slept against would keep the place of him. Pim outlived him by 2 and went the same gentle way. Hannah Voss died warm at 79 in the house I built her, and her granddaughters kept it, and the last time I passed it the cavity walls still held, and the hearth still drew, and a child I did not know was sleeping in the room I had raised, against the cold for a woman who had told me, before I understood her, to keep the door ready. Calvin Doss and I were never friends exactly, but he became the method's best teacher in the valley, more patient with the slow learners than I ever managed to be, and when he died his sons asked me to choose the stone for his marker, and I chose a clean gray block of boneyard granite and set it myself, keyed 2 feet down into the bedrock so it would not heave with the frost, and it has not. I am very old now, and I have outlived nearly everyone who climbed my road in the great cold, and the house still stands on the ridge as solid as the day the wall closed itself against the storm. Children who are not mine play in the long room. The spring still runs unfrozen in the back wall. On winter nights when the wind comes down off the granite, the way it has always come, the house takes the weight of it the way my father said a wall should, not by standing against it, but by knowing where it wants to go and letting it go there. And inside, a single fire holds the room warm, while the cold leans on 3 feet of stone and is turned, every time, the way it was turned the night 19 frightened people slept safe in a tomb that was never a tomb. My father left me no money. He left me the only inheritance that ever mattered, the kind that lives in the hands and passes from hand to hand and warms people the Maker never met 100 winters after the hands themselves are still. The wind comes down off the ridge tonight, and the house holds, and that is the whole of what he gave me. And it was enough.